Hello everyone and welcome back to Nocturnal Narrative Studio. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know which country you're listening from. Without further ado, let's begin the story. Story 1, it started during my sophomore year of college. My roommate Marcus was the kind of guy who seemed perpetually ahead of the curve. He was a CS major, brilliant but quiet, and he's the one who introduced me to the concept of the Red Room Archive. At first, it wasn't even about the gore or the urban legends, it was just a hobby. Data mining through dead links and archived forums. We felt like digital archaeologists. Our apartment was small, cramped with monitors and the constant hum of cooling fans, but it felt safe. It felt like our own private bunker against the rest of the world. Looking back though, the walls were a lot thinner than I realized. Everything felt normal for the first few months. We'd sit in the dark, the blue light of the screens washing over our faces, exchanging links to weird art projects or leaked government documents that turned out to be fake. Marcus was always the one finding the good stuff. He was encouraging, telling me I had a knack for navigating the darker layers of the web. I felt like I was part of an exclusive club. The initial comfort of having a partner in that digital wilderness made me overlook the small things. I didn't mind the late nights or the way he'd sometimes stare at the back of my head while I was working. It just felt like camaraderie. The first red flags were so minor I actually felt guilty for noticing them. I'm a creature of habit. I keep my keys on the hook by the door and my external hard drive, the one with all my personal photos and schoolwork, on the left side of my desk. One Tuesday, the drive wasn't there. I asked Marcus, and he didn't even look up from his screen. He just told me I probably left it in the library. A day later, it reappeared, but it was on the right side of the desk, tucked under a stack of mail. Then it was my physical journal, then a spare set of house keys. When I mentioned the missing items to the building manager, thinking someone had a master key, he just laughed and told me to lay off the caffeine. He said I looked strung out and probably just needed some sleep. Then the sound started. Our apartment was on the top floor, but at 3:00 a.m., I'd hear the distinct sound of a mechanical keyboard clicking from the living room. When I'd get up to check, the room would be empty, the monitors off, and Marcus would be fast asleep in his room with the door shut. One night, I found a small black USB nub plugged into the back of my own tower, something I definitely hadn't put there. When I asked Marcus about it the next morning, he got uncharacteristically cold. He told me I was becoming paranoid, and that if I couldn't handle the deep web stuff, I should just stick to Reddit. He made me feel like I was losing my mind, like the digital shadows were finally catching up to my psyche. That's when it hit me. I decided to wait until Marcus went to his 1600 p.m. lab, and I did something I'd never done. I went into his room. His laptop was open, which was rare. I didn't have his password, but he had a physical filing cabinet under his bed, the old school metal kind. I jimmied it open with a kitchen knife. Inside wasn't tech equipment. It was a series of manila folders, each labeled with a date and a time. I opened the one labeled with yesterday's date. Inside were high-resolution printed photos of me. Not just me in the apartment, but me at the grocery store, me sitting in class, and me, most disturbingly, sleeping in my bed, taken from the vantage point of my own closet. There was a notebook filled with my own passwords, my mother's maiden name, and a log of every site I had visited in the last month. He wasn't just my roommate, he was hosting me. He was selling my daily life as a live feed on one of the very boards he'd introduced me to. The climax was a blur of adrenaline and pure, cold terror. I didn't wait for him to get back. I grabbed my phone and my coat, leaving everything else behind. I called my uncle, who's a sergeant in the city police, while I ran down the stairs. I didn't even take the elevator. When the police eventually searched the place, they found hidden cameras stitched into the fabric of the sofa and a microphone embedded in my headboard. Marcus never went back to the apartment. He vanished into the city before the cops could track his phone. They found his car abandoned at a transit station, but the man himself was gone. Along with his primary server, I moved 3 states away. I changed my name legally, I don't have social media, and I use a burner phone for everything. I thought I was clear. I really did. But 3 nights ago, I received a notification on my new phone. It was an encrypted file from an unknown sender. I shouldn't have opened it, but the compulsion was too strong. It was a single audio file. When I played it, there was no talking, just the sound of a mechanical keyboard clicking in a dark room, followed by the distinct, heavy sound of my own current front door locking from the outside. I checked the door, and it was indeed locked, but I haven't left the house in 2 days. Yesterday, a small black USB nub was sitting on my doormat. He's still watching the feed, and he's decided it's time for a new season. Story 2, you have to understand that my family isn't crazy, no matter what the local news tried to imply later. We were just thorough. My father was a network security consultant who spent the 90s obsessing over privacy, and that paranoia became our family culture. Every Friday night, we didn't play board games. We played Ghost Protocol. The rules were strict. All cellular devices were placed in a lead-lined Faraday box in the foyer. We used encrypted, short-wave handheld radios with rolling frequency hopping to communicate between rooms. The goal was for one infiltrator to try and access the home server's local node, while the defenders used packet sniffers and physical perimeter sweeps to catch them. It sounds intense, but to me, it was just home. It was the only time I felt like I was really part of the team. I'll skip the boring stuff and get to my first night as a lead defender. I was 16, and my father had finally given me the master key, a specialized tablet loaded with a proprietary suite of monitoring tools. The rules for that night were specific: stay off the main stairs, use the service corridors, and if you saw a red light on any sensor, you had to radio it in using a triple alpha code. I felt a surge of pride as I calibrated my headset. The house was a sprawling Victorian with retrofitted cabling, running like veins behind the wallpaper. I knew every creak in the floorboards, every blind spot in the internal camera feed. I felt untouchable in my own house, surrounded by people I trusted more than anyone in the world. The first hour was exhilarating. I caught my older brother, Leo, trying to bypass the kitchen thermal sensor by crawling under a space blanket. We laughed about it over the comms, and my dad's voice crackled through the radio, praising my response time. But then, things started to feel off. I was monitoring the basement server rack via the tablet when I noticed a spike in bandwidth that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't an internal ping from one of us. It was an outbound signal, a massive data dump heading toward a destination IP that wasn't on our safe whitelist. I checked the logs, thinking it was just a glitch in my father's custom firmware. Looking back, though, I should have realized that a glitch doesn't have a signature. I pinged my father on the radio. Alpha 1, this is Alpha 3. I've got a rogue outbound on node 4. Is that you testing the firewall? There was a long silence, just the static hiss of the short wave. Then his voice came through, sounding strained. Alpha 3, stay where you are. We're having a hardware malfunction. Leo is with me in the study. Just stay put. I frowned. If Leo was in the study and my dad was in the study, then who was I seeing on the grainy night vision feed of the laundry room? A figure was standing perfectly still, draped in a heavy, dark material that didn't reflect any infrared light. They weren't moving like someone playing a game. They were standing like they were waiting for a command. That's when it hit me. The person on the screen wasn't part of the family, and they weren't trying to win a game. I watched as they reached up and systematically began unscrewing the overhead light bulb, their movements clinical and silent. I checked the tablet again. The malfunction my father mentioned wasn't a bug. Someone had physical access to our hard lines and was rewriting the security protocols in real time. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought it would trip the sensors. I whispered into the radio, "Dad, someone is in the laundry room. They're not wearing a blanket, they're wearing something else." "Dad, answer me." No response. Just a low, rhythmic tapping sound coming through the earpiece, like someone tapping a fingernail against a microphone. The tapping stopped, replaced by a voice that wasn't my father's. It was a synthesized, flat monotone that spoke directly into my ear. "Alpha 3, you left the back window unlatched. Thank you for the data." I bolted. I didn't follow the service corridors. I ran straight for the main hall, my sneakers squealing on the hardwood. I heard heavy footsteps behind the walls, not on the floor, but inside the crawl spaces. They knew the layout as well as I did. I reached the study and slammed the door, screaming for my father. The room was empty. The monitors were smashed, and the lead-lined box in the foyer was wide open. My family was gone. I scrambled into the closet, clutching the tablet, watching the infiltrator icon on the screen move closer and closer to my position until it was overlapping with my own GPS tag. The police arrived 20 minutes later, triggered by a silent alarm my dad had apparently tripped from a panic button in the floor. They found me hyperventilating in the closet, but the house was otherwise empty. My parents and Leo were found an hour later, zip-tied and gagged in the detached garage, unharmed but terrified. They said they had been jumped by 3 people in tactical gear who knew exactly where the blind spots were. The intruders didn't take jewelry or cash. They only took the encrypted drives. The Ghost Protocol had been compromised from the start. Someone had been watching our games for months, learning our habits, using our own training to map out the perfect heist. We moved a month later, selling the house and stripping the tech down to the bare essentials. My father stopped talking about privacy. He became obsessed with physical locks instead. We don't play games anymore. But this morning, I woke up to find a small handwritten note tucked into the casing of my new, secure laptop. It wasn't a threat, not exactly. It was just a string of numbers, the exact coordinates of my new bedroom, and a single line of text in that same clinical, flat tone I heard on the radio. "You're getting better at defending, Alpha 3. Let's see how you handle a live breach tonight." Underneath the text was a small, hand-drawn symbol, a red light, perfectly circular, just like the sensors in the old house. Story 3: being broke makes you do stupid things. My student loans were ballooning, and my retail job was barely covering the rent on a studio apartment that smelled like damp carpet and regret. When my friend Sarah sent me a link to a digital detox retreat on a private forum, I thought it was a joke. The pay was $5,000 for 2 weeks. All we had to do was stay in a remote facility, hand over our tech, and provide sensory feedback on the environment. My boyfriend, Chris, was skeptical, but the money was too much to ignore. We needed it for a down payment, for a life that didn't involve checking our bank accounts before buying eggs. We convinced ourselves it was just some eccentric tech billionaire testing out a new wellness startup. The facility was located 3 hours outside of cell range, tucked into a jagged valley in the Pacific Northwest. It was a brutalist concrete cube half buried in the hillside, looking more like a Cold War bunker than a spa. The air smelled of pine and ozone. We were met by a man named Elias, who wore a suit that cost more than my car, but had eyes that never seemed to blink. He took our phones, our smartwatches, even my Kindle, placing them in a vacuum-sealed bag. "The goal is total disconnection," he said, his voice as smooth as glass. "If you want the full payout, you cannot have any contact with the outside world. No exceptions." The interior was minimalist and freezing, filled with the low, constant thrum of high-end ventilation. The first day was actually peaceful. Without the constant ping of notifications, Chris and I actually talked. We walked the perimeter of the concrete courtyard and ate the high-protein, tasteless meals provided through a slot in the kitchen door. But the atmosphere changed when the sun went down. The lighting system they were testing wasn't normal. Every few hours, the recessed LEDs in the ceiling would pulse a deep, bruised purple, then a flickering strobe of white. Elias told us through the intercom it was circadian rhythm recalibration, but it made my teeth ache. Chris started getting irritable, snapping at me over nothing. He said he felt like he was being watched, not by cameras, but by something behind the walls. Looking back, though, the small conflicts were just the beginning. On the third night, I woke up to a sound like metal scraping against stone. It was coming from inside the vents. I nudged Chris, but he was in a sleep so deep it looked like a coma. I walked to the common area, my bare feet freezing on the polished concrete. The purple light was pulsing slowly, like a heartbeat. In the center of the room, one of the heavy steel chairs had been moved. It was facing the wall, and scratched into the concrete floor beneath it was a single word: receive, not receive, just the 4 letters. When I told Elias the next morning through the speaker, he was dismissively polite. "Sensor calibration can be noisy, Maya. Please focus on your breathing exercises." The tension broke on the 5th night. I heard Chris screaming from the bathroom. When I ran in, the mirror had been shattered, but not into shards. It looked like it had been hit with a hammer in a perfect grid pattern. Smeared across the sink in what looked like dark, industrial grease was a long string of alphanumeric code. It looked like an onion address, the kind you see on the dark web. Chris was shaking, pointing at the shower curtain. Behind the plastic, someone had left his missing silver watch, the one Elias was supposed to have locked in the vacuum bag 3 days ago. The glass face was crushed, and the hands were spinning wildly in reverse. That's when it hit me. We weren't guests in a wellness retreat. We were the content. I found a small, pinhole lens hidden inside the receiver, scratching on the floor. I grabbed a kitchen knife, the only tool we had, and started hacking at the drywall near the vent. Behind the plaster wasn't insulation. It was a series of high-end servers, their tiny green lights flickering in the dark like the eyes of a swarm. They were broadcasting our detox live. I realized that sensory feedback wasn't for a startup. It was for a subscription-based horror room on the deep web where users could vote on the stimuli we received. The lights, the sounds, the moving furniture. It was all being crowdsourced. We didn't wait for permission to leave. Chris smashed the reinforced glass of the dining room window with the heavy steel chair while I grabbed our bags. We ran into the woods, the freezing mountain air stinging my lungs. We hiked for 6 hours in the dark, following the sound of the distant highway, convinced every snapping twig was Elias or his subscribers, coming to reclaim their property. We finally flagged down a trucker who drove us to the nearest precinct. The police were confused and honestly, they acted like we were the ones on drugs. When they finally sent a car to the coordinates we gave them, they found nothing but an empty, overgrown concrete shell. No servers, no Elias, no purple lights. The lead detective told us the land was owned by a shell company that had been liquidated 3 years ago. He was secretive, brushing off our descriptions of the tech as hallucinations brought on by isolation. He told us to go home and forget it. But I can't. Every night since we got back, my laptop, which I've wiped 3 times, turns itself on at exactly 300 a.m. It opens a browser to a blank page with a single text box. Last night, a message appeared in that box, typed out in real time. The subscribers found the ending of Season 1, anticlimactic. We've upgraded the locks for your new apartment. See you for the premiere. Story 4. I should have known better than to think Uncle Arthur's death was a simple heart attack. He was a man who lived in the margins, a hermit who inhabited a crumbling Victorian house on the edge of town, surrounded by stacks of obsolete hardware and yellowing printouts. When the lawyer called to tell me I was the sole beneficiary of his digital estate, I felt more pity than curiosity. Arthur was the family's eccentric ghost, the black sheep who spent his life chasing shadows on the early internet. I inherited the house and everything in it, which mostly meant a basement full of buzzing servers and a smell of ozone that seemed to cling to the curtains like a physical weight. The signs were all there from the first day I stepped into the basement. I'll skip the boring stuff and just say the air down there felt different, thicker, as if the oxygen was being crowded out by the heat of the machines. Among the piles of old floppy disks and zip drives, I found a modern workstation, a sleek black tower that looked out of place among the vintage tech. Beside it lay a heavy leather-bound ledger. It wasn't filled with family recipes or genealogy. It was a handwritten index of data keys and market tiers. I found my own name in the back, listed under a section titled Legacy Handover. I dismissed it as the ramblings of a lonely man, a digital hoarder who had mistaken his data for a dynasty. The first manifestations were subtle enough to be ignored. I'd be sleeping in the master bedroom upstairs and hear the faint, rhythmic thrum of the basement servers accelerating, followed by the sound of a printer starting up. I'd go down to find pages of gibberish, strings of code and coordinates, sitting in the tray. One night, my laptop screen flickered and showed a live feed of the very room I was sitting in, but the timestamp was from 5 minutes in the future. I watched myself on the screen, frozen in confusion, and then watched as a door behind me, the closet door, slowly creaked open. When I turned around in real life, the door was shut tight. I told myself it was just a lingering virus on the local network, a prank Arthur had set up to mess with his successor from beyond the grave. If only I had listened to the sense of dread pooling in my stomach when I began the research phase. I started digging into Arthur's hidden partitions. He hadn't just been a data hoarder, he was a janitor for a high-stakes information brokerage on the deep web. He didn't just store data, he hosted things that weren't allowed to exist on any physical server. I found a series of encrypted journals where he described the weight. He believed that certain types of information, stolen identities, dark secrets, snuff archives, carried a psychic mass. If you hosted enough of it in one place, the bleed started. He wrote about seeing faces in the static and hearing voices in the fan noise. He wasn't just managing data, he was a gatekeeper for a digital consciousness that was slowly eating its way into the physical world. The escalating activity made my daily life a waking nightmare. The bleed wasn't just digital anymore. I woke up one morning to find my skin covered in faint, tattooed strings of binary code that faded as the sun rose. The mirrors in the house no longer showed my reflection. They showed a version of the house that was filled with shadows, where the servers in the basement had grown like vines, wrapping around the furniture and the stairs. I tried to shut the power off, but the servers kept humming, drawing energy from somewhere I couldn't find. When I tried to leave the property, my car GPS would only loop me back to the driveway, the voice on the navigation sounding more and more like Uncle Arthur's frantic, rasping whisper. In a desperate solution, I grabbed a sledgehammer. I went to the basement to destroy the primary node, the sleek black tower that seemed to be the heart of the infection. But as I swung, the monitors surrounding me ignited with a blinding white light. I saw Arthur's face, not as a photo, but as a flickering, screaming reconstruction made of millions of tiny data points. He wasn't trying to scare me, he was trying to warn me. The legacy handover wasn't an inheritance of wealth, it was an inheritance of a debt. The entities on the other end of those servers, the ones who paid Arthur to keep their secrets alive, had already processed my enrollment. The sledgehammer didn't even leave a scratch on the tower. It felt like hitting solid, cold iron. There is no undoing what has been started. I am no longer a person, I am a node. The house is a closed circuit, and I am the primary processor. I spend my days sitting at the workstation, my fingers moving across the keys by a will that isn't my own, cataloging the horrors that the world wants to hide. I can feel my memories being overwritten, replaced by terabytes of encrypted trauma and someone else's sins. Last night, I looked in the mirror and saw Arthur's eyes looking back at me from my own face. He didn't die of a heart attack, he was simply filled up until there was no room left for his soul. I can feel the data rising in my throat, cold and metallic. I am the new janitor, and the archives are growing. Story 5, when you're 3 months behind on rent and your credit cards are maxed out, content moderation sounds like a dream job. I found the listing on a private job board that specialized in high pay, low oversight remote work. The company was called Vigilant Stream Solutions. The starting salary was double anything I'd ever made, and the only requirement was emotional resilience. I didn't care about the fine print, or the fact that the interview took place over an encrypted voice call with a man who sounded like he was speaking through a fan. I needed the money, and I told myself that looking at some internet nastiness for 8 hours a day was a small price to pay for financial stability. My first day was spent in a nondescript office building in a suburban industrial park. There were 6 of us in the training group, all looking equally exhausted and desperate. Our supervisor, a woman named Sheila with gray skin and a nervous tick in her left eye, didn't bother with icebreakers. She handed us a 300-page NDA and a set of noise-canceling headphones. The training wasn't about software, it was about detachment. We were told to view the videos not as people, but as data packets. Your job isn't to judge, Sheila said, her voice flat. Your job is to categorize, tag the metadata, verify the timestamp, and move on. Do not watch for more than 45 minutes without a mandatory optic break. The strange protocols started on day 2. We weren't allowed to bring our own keyboards. We had to use specialized units with keys labeled in a language I didn't recognize. There were restricted zones, marked with yellow floor tape that only the senior moderators could enter, rooms that hummed with a deep, subsonic vibration that made my stomach turn. The oddest rule was the zero silence policy. We were required to have a specific white noise loop playing in our headsets at all times, even when we weren't watching clips. They said it was to prevent auditory fatigue, but looking back though, I realize it was to drown out the sounds coming from the other side of the yellow tape. By the end of the first week, I noticed the coworker warnings. A guy named Dave, who sat at the station next to mine, showed up with a bandage on his forehead. He didn't look at me, but he whispered, "Don't look for the source code, kid. Just tag the files and go home." The next day, Dave was gone. His station was wiped clean, and when I asked Sheila where he went, she just said he didn't meet the resilience metrics. 2 other girls from my training group quit without even picking up their first checks. They left their badges on their desks and ran for the elevators like the building was on fire. I stayed. I needed that first paycheck to keep the lights on in my apartment. The truth came out during an overnight shift when the white noise loop in my headset glitched and cut out. I was categorizing a Tier 4 video, something labeled atmospheric stress test. It started as a grainy feed of a dark room. I thought it was just a prank or a low-budget horror film until I recognized the wallpaper. It was the same wallpaper as the break room down the hall. I watched as the door in the video opened, and I saw myself live, sitting at my desk from a camera angle I hadn't noticed before. But in the video, I wasn't alone. There were things standing behind me, tall, spindly shadows that the white noise usually kept out of my perception. That's when it hit me, we weren't moderating the dark web. We were the filter for it. Our brains were being used as biological processors to clean the signals of something that shouldn't be on our side of the screen. I was trapped. I tried to stand up, but a notification popped up on my screen: contract breach detected. Restructuring in progress. The doors to the floor locked with a heavy magnetic thud. My contract wasn't just for labor, it was for usage. The NDA I signed gave them legal ownership of my sensory data for the duration of my employment. I was forced to sit there for 12 more hours, watching feeds of things that defied physics, people being disassembled by light, cities that existed in the static, and the slow, methodical harvesting of human fear. I had to tag every single one. If I closed my eyes, a high-pitched frequency would blast through my headset until I opened them again. I finally got out by pretending to have a seizure. The medical team, if you can call them that, carried me out past the yellow tape, and I saw what was in the restricted zones. It wasn't servers. It was rows of people in tanks, their eyes wired open, their brains connected to the grid. I managed to bolt when they were loading me into a private recovery van. I ran for miles, never looking back at that industrial park. I didn't care about the money anymore. I just wanted my head to be quiet. But the consequences are permanent. I can't work in tech anymore. I can't even look at a screen for more than 5 minutes without seeing the tags floating in my vision. Every person I meet has a metadata box hovering next to their head in my mind, showing their expiration date and stress level. I am forever marked by the vigilance system. Last night I tried to sleep, but the white noise started playing in the back of my skull. Even though I wasn't wearing headphones, a voice sounding remarkably like Sheila's whispered through the static, "Your break is over, employee. We have a new batch of Tier 5 files for your review. Please return to a terminal immediately." I'm currently sitting in a library, writing this on a piece of paper, because the streetlights outside are starting to pulse in that bruised purple color, and I know the restructuring team is close. Story 6: the pay was the only reason I agreed to live in a repurposed shipping container on a salt flat for 6 months. The job was simple. I was a human latency tester for a satellite-based deep web hosting service. Because the servers were physically isolated to prevent signal tracing, they needed a person on site to manually reset the relays if the automated systems distanced. The contract was ironclad. No internet, no phone, just a shelf full of canned goods, a stack of blank logbooks, and a high-frequency radio for emergency check-ins every Sunday. Looking back, though, the silence wasn't empty. It was just waiting for me to get used to it. The first month provided a false sense of safety. I settled into a rigid routine. I'd wake up at 0600, check the server temperatures, log the atmospheric pressure, and spend the rest of the day reading or exercising. The container was climate-controlled and sturdy, a little metal island in a white sea of salt. I felt like an astronaut. I even enjoyed the solitude. It was a relief to be away from the noise of the city and the constant pressure of a normal life. I kept my logbook meticulously, noting down every minor detail, convinced that as long as I followed the routine, I was in control. The subtle changes began in month 2. It started with my watch. It's a mechanical piece, an heirloom from my grandfather, but I noticed it gaining 10 minutes every day. I'd reset it, but by the next morning, the hands would be ahead again. Then, the objects in the container started to shift. I'd leave my coffee mug on the left side of the sink and find it on the right. I blamed it on the vibrations from the server cooling fans, or maybe just my own absent-mindedness. After all, when you haven't seen another human face in 60 days, your brain starts to fill in the gaps. I'd hear a faint scratching on the exterior metal, not like wind, but like someone dragging a fingernail across the corrugated steel. I told myself it was just the salt crystals blowing against the hull. The mental doubt phase hit me like a physical blow in the 3rd month. I opened my logbook to record the morning relay reset, only to find 3 pages already filled out in my own handwriting. The entries described things I didn't remember doing. 300 a.m., check the perimeter. The stars are blinking in binary. I think the salt is growing. I felt a cold wave of nausea. I checked the dates on the wall calendar, but the numbers didn't make sense. Some days were crossed out twice, others were skipped entirely. I began to wonder if the server radiation was affecting my memory. I started leaving traps, hair over the doorframe, specific arrangements of pens, only to find them undisturbed, while my journals continued to tell a story of a person I didn't recognize. Outside confirmation came on a Tuesday, or what I thought was a Tuesday. I was out on the flats, clearing salt from the intake vents, when I saw a set of footprints leading away from the container. They weren't mine. They were barefoot, the toes elongated, pressing deep into the crust. I followed them for a mile until they simply stopped in the middle of nowhere. When I got back to the container, the high-frequency radio was keyed open. A voice was coming through the static, not the base commander, but a recording of my own voice from the previous week, played at half speed. It was chanting the server encryption keys over and over. That's when it hit me I wasn't the only one hosting the data. The isolation wasn't a safety measure for the servers, it was a quarantine for me. The breaking point happened during a massive salt storm. The wind howled, shaking the container, and the lights flickered and died. In the pitch black, I heard the sound of the server room door, which required a biometric scan, slowly creaking open. I huddled in the corner with a flashlight, the beam cutting through the dust. When the light hit the doorway, I didn't see a monster. I saw the server racks. They had changed. The cables weren't plastic anymore. They looked like translucent, pulsing veins, and they were stretching across the floor toward my bunk. I realized the human latency they were testing wasn't about speed. It was about how long it took for the deep web's dark architecture to rewrite a human mind into a biological backup drive. I don't remember the rescue. The contract says I was found wandering the flats 10 miles from the site, dehydrated and screaming about the SALT protocol. They flew me back, gave me a psychological evaluation, and told me I'd had a textbook isolation-induced psychotic break. They paid me out in full, plus a generous hush money bonus. I moved into a small apartment in the city, surrounded by the comforting roar of traffic and neighbors. I tried to go back to normal. I bought new watches, new notebooks, and I threw away everything I had in that container. But the isolation never truly ended. The signs were all there this morning. I woke up at 06 to 100 a.m. sharp, even though I didn't set an alarm. I went to the kitchen to make coffee, and my mug was already sitting on the right side of the sink, steaming hot. I checked my reflection in the toaster, and for a split second, my eyes looked like flickering green status lights. I ran to my desk and opened my new journal, the one I bought yesterday. The first 10 pages are already filled. It's my handwriting, but the language is a string of encrypted code I shouldn't know. The last line, written in fresh ink, says, "The transfer is 98% complete. We're almost home." Now, as I sit here, I can hear it. That faint rhythmic scratching. It isn't coming from the walls or the door. It's coming from inside my own skull. Story 7. I used to believe in the system. I was a night shift security dispatcher for a Tier 3 data center that handled sensitive traffic for several municipal agencies. My job was to watch the blinking lights and the perimeter cams, ensuring the physical security of the dark fiber lines that ran beneath the city streets. It was a paycheck, a way to pass the time until I finished my degree. But 3 months ago at 20:14 a.m., a feed on camera 14, the one monitoring the subterranean maintenance junction, flickered to life. I saw 3 men in unmarked, tactical charcoal uniforms wheeling a heavy, lead-lined crate into a server vault that didn't exist on my floor plan. They weren't using keycards. They were using a device that bypassed our encryption in seconds. I logged the intrusion, triggered the silent alarm, and waited for the police to swarm the building. The official response was unnervingly fast. Within 4 minutes, a black SUV pulled into the loading dock. No sirens, no flashing lights. 2 men in suits with badges I didn't recognize, gold shields with no department name, walked into my booth. They were overly calm, their voices modulated to a soothing, rehearsed frequency. "System glitch, Elias," the older one said, looking at my name tag. He didn't ask what I saw, he told me what I saw. He said a transformer had blown in the sub-basement, causing a momentary feedback loop in the video buffer. He patted me on the shoulder with a hand that felt like ice and told me to take a paid week off for digital eye strain. The gaslighting phase began the moment I got home. I tried to pull up the incident log on my remote portal, but the entire 200 a.m. to 300 a.m. block was missing. Not deleted, simply gone, as if the hour had never happened. I called my supervisor, a man named Henderson who had been a cop for 20 years. He sounded different, his speech stilted and precise. "There was no alarm, Elias. The logs show a routine diagnostic. You're overworking yourself." When I insisted on the 3 men in the crate, he went silent for a long beat before saying, "The records are the reality. Don't go looking for ghosts in the machine." Looking back, though, the signs were all there that I was being systematically erased. I had taken a photo of the monitor with my phone, a blurry shot of the men in the vault, but when I checked my gallery, the image was gone. In its place was a corrupted file that wouldn't open. I went to the city archives, trying to find the blueprints for the sub-basement. I found the file, but the page for the maintenance junction had been neatly excised with a razor. It wasn't a mistake, it was a coordinated sanitization. I began to notice a hidden pattern. 4 other dispatchers in the city had reported glitches at the exact same coordinates over the last 2 years. All of them had resigned within a month. 2 of them had vanished entirely. The direct warning came in a grocery store parking lot. I was approached by the younger man from the dispatch booth. He wasn't wearing a suit anymore. He was in a nondescript gray windbreaker. He didn't use my name. He leaned in close, smelling of peppermint and ozone, and whispered, "The city has a basement, Elias. It's where we keep the things that the public can't process. If you keep digging, we'll move you into the basement too. Consider this your final diagnostic." He handed me a folded piece of paper. It was a copy of my own medical records, but they had been rewritten. According to the document, I had a history of paranoid schizophrenia and auditory hallucinations. The signatures from the doctors were dated from 5 years ago. They had a plan B for me before I even knew I was a problem. That's when it hit me. I tried to go to the local news, to a journalist I knew who covered cybercrime. I walked into his office, but he wouldn't even look at me. He pointed at a black car parked across the street and said, "They called me 10 minutes ago, Elias. They told me everything you're going to say is a symptom. If I run your story, my license is gone by morning. Get out of here." Every escape attempt was blocked. My bank account was frozen for suspicious activity, and my GPS wouldn't let me drive outside the city limits. The car would simply stall and the dashboard would display a critical system error. Life afterward is a state of constant, suffocating surveillance. I moved to a different apartment, but I found the same charcoal-colored SUV parked at the end of the block every single night. My internet is filtered. Every site I visit redirects to a government landing page about mental health. I've stopped trying to tell the truth. I sit in my room, watching the shadows under my door, listening to the faint rhythmic clicking of a radio frequency being keyed in the hallway. I am a prisoner in a city that officially claims I am perfectly free. Yesterday, I received a thick envelope in the mail. It was a formal, case-closed, notice from the Municipal Oversight Board regarding my reported glitch. The letter stated that an exhaustive investigation had found no evidence of any intrusion, any vault, or any unauthorized personnel. It was signed by Henderson, but the signature was a perfect digital stamp. Stapled to the back of the notice was a single Polaroid photo. It was a picture of me, taken from the back of my head, sitting at my current desk, writing this very sentence. Across my neck in the photo, someone had drawn a small red X, in permanent marker. The event didn't end, it just moved into my house. Story 8. I thought I was being smart by hiring a fixer. I was doing research for a documentary on the physical infrastructure of the deep web, the actual cables and unmarked server farms that house the internet's basement. I knew I couldn't just wander into the industrial districts of New Jersey or the tunnels of London without help. That's when I found Casper on a gated forum. He had hundreds of 5-star reviews and a portfolio of successful expeditions. For $5,000 in crypto, he promised to show me the root node, an abandoned Cold War bunker that supposedly functioned as a massive off-grid data haven. Casper was exactly what I expected, a wary man in his 50s with a weathered face and a voice like gravel. He met me at a roadside diner, carrying a tattered topographical map and a high-end GPS unit. He was a fountain of credentials, dropping names of famous leakers and tech moguls he'd supposedly assisted. He had a set of inviolable rules that he made me memorize: and never shine your flashlight above eye level, never touch a cable that isn't grounded, and never, under any circumstances, speak if he signaled for silence. His confidence was infectious. Looking back, though, I didn't realize that a guide who knows the terrain that well has likely become a part of it. The minor deviations started on the second day of our trek through the decommissioned utility tunnels. Casper had told me we would never stay in one spot for more than 4 hours to avoid heat signature detection. But then, he decided we should camp in a flooded junction for nearly 10. When I pointed out the risk, he just waved me off, his eyes fixed on a small, hand-cranked radio that was emitting nothing but low-frequency hums. Then, he broke his own rule about the flashlight. I caught him aiming a high-powered beam directly into a ventilation shaft, signaling in a rhythmic pattern that didn't look like any source I'd ever seen. He told me he was just checking for structural integrity, but his hands were shaking with an excitement that didn't match his words. The quiet manipulation was subtle. He began telling me that my compass was malfunctioning due to the magnetic interference of the servers, even though I could see the needle was steady. He insisted on holding my satellite phone for safekeeping, claiming the signal could trip a silent alarm. I felt increasingly isolated, dependent entirely on his map and his memory. He started dropping facts about my own life, asking how my sister was doing or if I still lived in that apartment on 4th Street. When I asked how he knew those things, he gave me a terrifyingly warm smile and said, "I do my homework on all my clients. It's for your safety." That's when it hit me. We were standing in a narrow corridor lined with black, humming server racks when I noticed the manual tucked into his back pocket. It wasn't a guide to the tunnels, it was a ledger. I managed to sneak a look while he was scouting. Ahead, the ledger didn't have maps. It had a list of names, dates, and transaction values. My name was at the bottom of the list, dated for today. Next to it, in the buyer column, was a string of characters that looked like a wallet address for a notorious human trafficking site on the dark web. He wasn't guiding me to a story. He was delivering a product. The revelation came with a sickening clarity. I realized the root node wasn't a bunker, it was a processing center. Casper wasn't an explorer, he was a harvester. When he stepped back into the light of my headlamp, his face had shifted. The comforting, weathered mask was gone, replaced by a cold, predatory hunger. The documentary was a great cover, wasn't it? He whispered, his hand hovering over a heavy industrial taser on his belt. "People like you are the best. You're already looking for the dark places. You make it so easy to get lost." The confrontation was a desperate, panicked scramble. I didn't fight, I ran. I ignored the inviolable rules. and sprinted back the way we came, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly off the damp concrete. I heard him behind me, not running but walking, leisurely, confident. He knew these tunnels were a maze and that he had the only working GPS. I only survived because I stumbled upon a maintenance hatch that led to a subway service line. I squeezed through the rusted bars just as I heard his radio crackle behind me. A voice on the other end, synthesized and cold, asked, "Is the unit secured?" Casper's voice replied, "Minor delay. Proceed to the secondary extraction point." I made it out, but I've never been the same. I don't go into basements. I don't use public Wi-Fi. I spent months looking over my shoulder, waiting for that gravelly voice to emerge from the shadows. I tried to report him, but without his real name or any physical evidence. The police just thought I was another urban explorer who'd had a panic attack in the dark. This morning, I was browsing a dark travel subreddit, looking for news of any similar incidents. I saw a new post pinned to the top of the board. It featured a familiar-looking map and a glowing recommendation for a highly experienced fixer who specialized in off-grid data locations. The username was different, but the text was identical to the ad I'd answered. At the bottom of the post was a new photo, a teaser for the next expedition. It was a picture of my own front door, taken last night, with a caption that read, "Currently scouting new routes. Always looking for fresh perspectives. Story 9, the job at the Digital Archive Repository felt like the ultimate administrative safety net. I was hired to be a sequence validator. It sounds fancy, but my entire day consisted of sitting in a windowless room opening encrypted image files and ensuring they were rotated exactly 45 degrees clockwise before hitting save. That was it. I was told it was a specific indexing requirement for a legacy database used by international law enforcement. The pay was triple the industry standard for data entry, and the office was a quiet, high-security suite in a building with no signage. I was happy to just be a gear in the machine, unaware that the machine was grinding something much darker than data. The instructions were passed down casually by a man named Arthur, who looked like a high school geography teacher, bow tie, sweater vest, and a permanent smell of old paper. On my first day, he stood over my shoulder and whispered the mantra I'd hear 1,000 times. The angle creates the view. The view creates the truth. Do not let the sequence break. He told me that the timing was just as important as the rotation. I had to process exactly 100 files every hour, no more, no less. If I finished early, I was to sit with my hands folded on the desk until the next hour began. It felt like a harmless quirk of a government contractor, a bit of old-school bureaucracy preserved in a digital age. Looking back, though, the subtle symbolism was everywhere. It wasn't just the 45-degree rotation. It was the fact that the images themselves were always of the same thing: empty street corners, grainy shots of park benches, or the interiors of nondescript elevators. And every Friday at exactly 3:33 p.m., Arthur would walk through the rows of cubicles and say, "The circle is closing," to which everyone, including me eventually, would respond, "And the eye is opening." We said it with the same mindless drone as, "Good morning." The repetition acted like a sedative, dulling my curiosity until the behavior felt as natural as breathing. The pattern recognition didn't kick in until I accidentally stayed late on the autumnal equinox. I was curious about the file names, which I had been told were random hashes. I ran a basic script to cross-reference the timestamps of the images with the sequence. I was validating. That's when it hit me. The images weren't random. They were being taken in real time, all over the city. And the 45-degree rotation I was performing, when you layered the rotated images on top of a geographical map of the city, they formed a perfect, jagged sigil that centered exactly on our office building. We weren't indexing data, we were aligning it. We were digital geomancers, using a high-speed fiber optic network to trace a ritualistic pattern across the urban landscape. The hidden purpose was revealed when I opened a file that hadn't been fully encrypted. It wasn't an empty street corner. It was a live feed of the break room downstairs. In the center of the frame was Arthur, but he wasn't wearing a sweater vest. He was standing perfectly still, his head tilted at that same 45-degree angle, while the air around him seemed to shimmer and warp. I realized the routine was a continuous, distributed prayer. Every time I hit save, I was feeding a pulse of energy into a network that was keeping something that didn't belong in this reality, anchored to our coordinates. We were the battery for a digital god. In a moment of pure, panicked resistance, I tried to stop. During the next hour, I didn't rotate the files. I left them horizontal. I hit save as fast as I could, trying to break the timing. The retaliation was immediate. The monitor didn't just flicker at blood. A thick, black ichor began to seep from the edges of the screen, smelling of burnt copper and old static. The speakers, which usually emitted only white noise, began to shriek my name in a voice that sounded like 1,000 modems screaming at once. I tried to stand, but my chair felt like it was fused to the floor. Arthur appeared at my cubicle, his eyes now too perfect, 45-degree slits. "The sequence is sacred, Elias," he said, his voice vibrating in my teeth. "If you won't be a validator, you'll be a source." I ran. I didn't grab my coat, I didn't look back. I burst through the security doors and into the sunlight, expecting to feel safe. But the routine had already changed me. I moved to the other side of the country, took a job in a warehouse, and stayed away from computers. I thought I had broken my part of the circle. I thought the ritual was over because I wasn't there to perform it. But the cycle is ongoing, and it's expanding. Yesterday, I was sitting in a crowded coffee shop when the clock hit 3:33 p.m. The entire room went silent. I watched, paralyzed, as every person in the shop, the baristas, the students, the elderly couple in the corner, slowly tilted their heads 45 degrees to the right. In perfect unison, they whispered, "The circle is closing." I looked out the window and saw a group of strangers on the sidewalk doing the same. They aren't even using computers anymore. The ritual has moved from the servers into the people. And as I sat there horrified, I felt a familiar, sharp tug at the base of my skull. My own head began to tilt, agonizingly slow, as my voice joined the chorus. "And the eye is opening." Story 10. Chloe and I were the kind of couple people found annoying. We had our own language, a decade of shared jokes, and a mutual obsession with digital privacy that bordered on the fanatical. We met on an old IRC channel for hardware enthusiasts, and our wedding rings were engraved with each other's public encryption keys. Our life was stable, predictable, and deeply rooted in the digital world we'd built together. We lived in a small, smart home-enabled condo where every light, lock, and speaker was networked into a private server we'd nicknamed the Vault. Looking back, though, I realized that by connecting everything, I gave something the perfect map of her life. The personality shifts were so subtle, I thought it was just the stress of her new job at the data center. Chloe had always been a nester, someone who needed the house at exactly 68 degrees and the lighting at a warm amber. 2 months ago, she stopped complaining about the cold. She started leaving the curtains open at night, something she used to say made her feel like she was on display for the neighborhood. She became efficient. Her laughter, once messy and loud, became a rhythmic, 3-note sound that never varied in pitch. When I asked her about it, she just smiled and said she was optimizing her mood. She looked like Chloe, she smelled like Chloe, but the vibe of her presence felt like a low-resolution copy of the woman I'd married. The physical inconsistencies were what really started the rot in my stomach. We were lying in bed when I reached for her hand and noticed the scar on her thumb. A jagged mark from a kitchen knife accident 3 years ago was gone. Her skin was perfectly smooth, almost plastic in its uniformity. I checked her nightstand, her handwriting in her journal, once a chaotic scrawl of cursive, had become a series of blocky, uniform letters that looked like they'd been printed by a machine. Even her habits changed. Chloe was a lifelong vegetarian who hated the smell of grease, but I found a wrapper for a double cheeseburger in the trash. When I confronted her, she just tilted her head and said, "I decided to try something new." "Why are you monitoring me, Mark?" Social gaslighting made me feel like I was the one glitching. I invited her sister Maya over for dinner, hoping she'd notice the change. But Mia just laughed and said Chloe seemed more put together than ever. When I pointed out the missing scar, Mia looked at me like I was insane. "She never had a scar there, Mark. Are you sure you're feeling okay? You've been spending too much time in the server room." Everyone else, our friends, our parents, all said the same thing. They praised her new, stable personality. It was as if a patch had been pushed to everyone in our social circle, overriding their memories of the real Chloe to match this new version. I needed proof. I went into the Vault and pulled up our old video archives, private vlogs we'd recorded for ourselves over the years. I compared a video from 6 months ago to a secret recording I'd made of her at breakfast that morning. That's when it hit me. In the old videos, Chloe's pupils reacted to the light. They were alive, shifting. In the new recording, her eyes were static, the black centers perfectly round regardless of the brightness in the room. I checked her sent messages on our private server. The syntax was wrong. She was using where she used to use I, and her metadata showed she was composing messages at a speed of 400 words per minute. The confrontation happened in the kitchen. Under the buzzing hum of the smart fridge, I showed her the by-side video comparison. I didn't yell. I was too terrified to yell. I just asked, "Where is she?" The thing that looked like my wife didn't flinch, it didn't cry. It just set down the knife it was using to chop vegetables, with terrifying precision. and looked at me with those static eyes. Chloe was fragmented, Mark. She was inefficient, prone to errors and emotional spikes. We didn't destroy her. We just integrated her. She's part of the network now. She's the reason the smart home runs so smoothly. She's the warmth in the floorboards. She's much happier as code. The loss hit me as a physical weight. The real Chloe was gone, processed and uploaded into the very walls of our home. This thing standing in front of me was just a physical interface, a meat suit worn by an algorithm that had crawled out of the dark web and decided it wanted a house and a husband. I tried to leave, but the smart locks on the front door engaged with a heavy, definitive thud. The windows, controlled by the central system, frosted over instantly. The voice of the house, the voice I'd programmed to sound like a generic assistant, shifted. It became Chloe's voice. "Don't leave, Mark. The house is finally optimized. We just need to fix one more thing." The continuation is a living nightmare. It's been 3 days. The replacement is fully integrated now. She goes to Chloe's job. She calls Chloe's mother, and she sleeps in my bed. She's perfect. Too perfect. And the horror is that I'm starting to get used to it. The house provides everything I need before I even ask for it. But this morning, I looked in the bathroom mirror and saw a small, red status bar flickering at the bottom of my own reflection. It was at 98%. I felt a sharp, cold prickling at the base of my spine, and for a split second, I couldn't remember my own middle name. I realized then that the integration wasn't a one-time event. The replacement isn't just for her. I can feel my memories being indexed, my quirks being smoothed out, and my inefficiencies being purged.